This is Panzer Paints and welcome to my first ever YouTube video. Today I will be painting the ASU-85 assault gun from the game Team Yankee by Battlefront Miniatures. Okay, so it's time to get started. This particular kit is a mixture of resin and metal parts. To ensure we get a great bond between the resin hull and the metal track, I like to score the hull using a small hobby knife. With that being done, now it's time to glue the track to the hull. Just using some cheap super glue here. After the first track is set, then it's time to move on to the second one, just using the same technique, holding the tracks together to ensure we get a great bond. Gluing the hatch in a closed position is a relatively easy task, just a dab of super glue and then maneuvering the hatch into place. Using some super glue here to attach the barrel to the hull. These can sometimes be a little bit difficult to maneuver into place. Next time I'd probably recommend using gel-based super glue. For me, drilling out the barrels is just something I've always done, so not really a necessary step when completing this model, but something I've just grown to do in all my models. As you can see, I just think it makes it look a little bit more realistic. This might also be seen as a little bit of overkill, but I like to use simple green to wash all my resin models. I've just had a bad experience with one particular model that the primer did not stick to, so nowadays I always use simple green to give them all the resin parts a quick wash before priming. After the model's completely dry, I'm just going to attach it to the top of a screw here with some blue tack. This will just make it a little bit easier to handle when we're priming and painting the model. To prime this miniature, I'm going to use a Vallejo surface primer, colour Desert Tan. My thoughts with this is I'm going to start with the lightest colour possible and then move up to the green colour. When priming, I'm not using any airbrush thinners, I'm just using the primer straight from the bottle after giving it a good shake, and what I'm doing here is building up lots of thin layers at about 30 psi. Just to make it a little bit easier to watch, I've sped up the footage by 16, and as you can see, I'm slowly building up those layers and constantly using the screw to move the miniature around to make sure I'm getting every part of the miniature fully covered. And for best results, I like to leave my miniature overnight to fully cure before moving on to the next step. For the next step, what we're going to use is blue tack to mask the light desert tan colour. I prefer to use new blue tack straight from the packet, and then as you can see here, I'm just simply rolling it into small sausage shapes. Now I'm just rolling it out on my table just to get it a little bit thinner. Now I'm going to take those sausages of blue tack and carefully lay it over the miniature, trying to create the camouflage pattern. From here, it does look like that blue tack is a little bit too thick, but that makes it very easy to remove later on. As you can see here, I'm just pushing down the blue tack nice and firmly to make sure that we're going to have no gaps where paint can get in. Here I'm just using a hobby knife to cut off any excess blue tack. With all the upper hull being completely masked with blue tack, I'm just going to simply roll little balls to cover the road wheels. Overall, I'm happy with the masking. Now it's time to move on to the stage of applying the green paint. When it comes to mixing the paint, I use a rough ratio of 50% paint, 10% airbrush flow improver and 40% airbrush thinner. So here you can see me adding the green paint, just a little squirt, then 3 or 4 drops of airbrush flow improver, and here roughly about 40% airbrush thinner. Now I'm just giving the paint a good mix with a spatula until we get a nice skim milk consistency. Now it's time to add the paint to the airbrush and then move on to light thin coats making sure we're getting all areas that are not masked by the blue tack. As you can see, it doesn't take too long for that nice green colour to build up. And then from here, as before with the primer, I'm just going to leave that overnight. Leaving that paint overnight to dry has left us with a really deep, intense green colour, which is looking really good. Now it's time to remove all the blue tack and see the finished product. As you can see, by having the blue tack in nice long thick strips, it's very easy to remove. While masking the tank did take a great deal of time, the end result is well worth the effort. Now it's time to move on to painting the tracks, and I'm going to be using flat earth, just thinned down with a little bit of water. Just giving the paint a good mix because I will be applying it fairly liberally. With the paint tracks being heavily textured, it is going to take a little bit of time to work that paint into all the nooks and crannies. So now I'm just going to speed up the footage so you can see the whole process. With the vehicle being attached to the screw via blue tack, it makes it very easy to move it around and making sure that you're getting all the bits of the track covered in the paint. Now with the tracks complete, it's time to move on to the third colour for the camouflage. For this I'm going to be using Vallejo colour Black Grey. To apply the camouflage pattern, I create an outline of where I'd like the black paint to go and then fill in the black paint. I did start using a fairly fine brush to apply the camouflage initially, but as I built up the confidence I did move to a larger brush, making it a little bit quicker. Here you can see the finished result of adding the black camouflage to the assault gun. Having the black ready to go, I'm going to paint the road wheels, the searchlights, and any other tools that are on the outside of the vehicle. Here I'm taking a little bit of a bright red colour and mixing it with the black grey to make a deep red colour for the infrared searchlights. I don't know how accurate this is, but I'm just going to take some Panzerracer's light rust and paint this exhaust here, which will get toned down later with the wash. For all the wooden parts, I'm going to use Panzerracer's new wood. I did have a lot of challenges with this paint. I'm not sure whether I didn't shake it enough, but I found it very, very hard to get coverage, good coverage on any of the wooden handles. It took a long time to build up this colour. I might revert back to using beige brown. As you can see here, it seems like it's sort of dried glossy. Before applying the decals, I'm just going to use a gloss varnish, in this case Citadel's Ard Coat. Putting down a nice thin coat everywhere that I'm going to put a decal. Now using a small pair of scissors, I'm just going to remove the decals. One trick I have found when doing decals is to use the least amount of water possible. The more water, the more time you'll spend fishing around trying to find the decal. So use less and save yourself some time. After soaking for 2 or 3 minutes, I'm then going to use an old paintbrush to maneuver the decal off the backing paper and into position. Sometimes they fall right into place, and other times you're going to take a little bit of time to maneuver them to get them right in the spot where they need to be. I'm also adding a number to the rear of the assault gun and also to the side. When I'm happy with the positioning of the decal, I'm just coming in with some tissue paper to dry the decal. Then back with another layer of Ard Coat over the decal to protect it. This step is completely optional, but I do love putting a bit of black smoke pigment powder at the end of the barrels. Then to keep that pigment in place, I'm just going to use a little bit of pigment fixer, just dabbing it slightly at the end of the barrel. Next up, I'm going to apply a layer of lacquer based paint, in this case X22 Clear by Tamiya. I use this for a couple of reasons. The first one is to put a protective layer down to avoid chipping the acrylic paint, and also to protect the acrylic paint from the enamel wash that I'll do in the next step. To thin the paint for airbrush use, it's just an equal part of the X22 clear and a lacquer base thinner. I give that a good mix before adding it to the airbrush and applying it to the vehicle at around 30 psi. After an hour of drying, it looks very shiny and is ready for the next step, which is a dark brown enamel wash. At this scale, it's not really worth doing a fine pin wash, just a general wash all over the vehicle. This will save you a great deal of time when you're painting many of these vehicles. After about 2 hours, your enamel wash will go from a wet, shiny look to a dull appearance, and that way you know it's dry. Moving on to the fun part, which is using odorless solvents to remove all the excess wash. Because the miniature has been coated in a lacquer-based clear coat, you can be quite vigorous with this. So when your cotton bud does get full of wash, change it or rotate it over. As you keep working the cotton buds over the miniature, you'll see it change and less wash will appear on the cotton bud. This is when you know that you're on the right path and you're almost finished. Overall, I'm happy with that, and it's time to move on to the next step. For a long time I used dull coat, but this ultra matte varnish by AK is fantastic, and the results you get at the end are well worth it. It's going to be very hard to go back to dull coat with results like this. Using Vallejo's buff, I'm just going to go over the miniature, giving it a light dry brush. Taking my time, I'm just slowly passing over the miniature, trying to get all the raised edges to pop. The end result is very subtle, but well worth the effort. At this stage you could call it done, but I'm just going to pick up a couple of little areas just to make the miniature stand out a little bit more. Starting with 2 shovels that I missed. At this point I was going to have to go back and paint some handles for the shovels that I missed, so I pulled out the beige brown and also touched up all the wooden areas. Then it was time to highlight all the metal areas with gunmetal grey from Vallejo. Because I wasn't weathering the tracks, I thought this was a great opportunity to give the tracks a light dry brush in gunmetal grey. I feel that this finish suits a modern tank. The infrared searchlight seems to have been washed out with the matte varnish, so I'm just going to come back here and using a little bit more brighter red, just touch up those searchlights just to make them pop a little bit more. Next up is metallic medium, which is a fantastic colour for headlights. It's quite a thick metallic paint, so take some time to thin it down to get a nice consistency. Here I'm putting in a couple of dots where the headlights would be. With the tank being so flat, I thought it was a great opportunity to put some gloss back into it, so just putting some gloss over the headlights and also the searchlights. With that being done, it was time to call this ASU-85 complete. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.